They said an old immigrant janitor was stealing from the building, and everyone believed it, because it was easier than asking questions. A retired Navy SEAL lived there too, quiet, distant, with a German shepherd that watched more than it moved. He didn't step in when the accusation happened, but his dog reacted in a way that didn't make sense to anyone else. No barking, no aggression, just a stillness that marked something wrong, something hidden. As patterns emerged and silence began to crack, the truth slowly surfaced where no one wanted to look. This is not a story about violence, but about dignity, instinct, and justice without a single shot fired. If stories like this matter to you, please like, comment, and subscribe to help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Ethan Walker moved into the building the way men like him always did, quietly, with no intention of being remembered. The complex sat on the edge of a city that had grown too fast and forgotten the people who had built it. Concrete stained by decades of rain, balconies patched with mismatched repairs, hallways that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and old wiring. A banner hung crookedly above the main entrance, its vinyl edges peeling. Future site of renewal. Ethan read it once and never looked at it again. He chose the place precisely because no one here asked questions. A man living alone with a large German shepherd didn't draw attention in a building full of people too tired to look closely at anyone else. Ethan liked that. After years of being trained to observe everything, anonymity felt like a kind of rest. At 40, Ethan carried his body the way soldiers did, long after they left the uniform behind. He stood straight without effort, shoulders broad, his weight evenly balanced, as if the ground itself might shift without warning. His skin was weathered, sun-darkened, textured by wind and salt and long days under skies that offered no shade. His hair was cut short in a tactical military style, clean at the sides, just long enough on top to resist looking groomed. Faint silver threaded through the brown at his temples. The stubble along his jaw was trimmed with the same discipline he applied to everything else. His eyes, blue-gray and steady, missed nothing, even when he seemed lost in thought. Ranger stayed at his side. The dog was a full-grown German shepherd, 6 or 7 years old, large and powerfully built without heaviness. His back was straight and strong, his chest deep, his movements economical and controlled. The classic black and tan coat lay thick and close to his body, the dark saddle across his back fading into warm brown along his legs and chest. His ears stood erect, always angled forward, always listening. Ranger did not pull on the leash or wander. He moved as if he understood that space itself was something to be measured. They had been there barely a week when it happened. The morning was early, the hour when the building exhaled. Doors clicked shut, elevators hummed. The sound of footsteps echoed and disappeared. Ethan stood near the mailboxes, sorting envelopes without hurry. Ranger lay beside him, calm, his chin resting on his paws. That was when the voices cut through the quiet. "You think I'm stupid?" a man snapped. Ethan didn't turn right away. He didn't need to. Miguel Alvarez stood near the janitor's cart, his hands wrapped tightly around the handle, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He was small compared to the man confronting him, his shoulders slightly rounded from age and years of physical labor. Miguel was in his early 60s, with a thin frame, dark skin weathered by sun and cleaning solvents, and gray hair cropped close to his scalp. His uniform, faded gray, carefully clean, hung loosely on him. His face carried deep lines, not just from age, but from restraint. A lifetime of choosing silence over argument. The man looming over him was Thomas Reed, the building manager. Reed wore pressed slacks and a pale button-down shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest approachability. His hair was neatly combed, dark with only a hint of gray. His posture relaxed in a way that communicated authority without effort. His face held a practiced expression of disappointment, the kind that suggested moral superiority rather than anger. "I already told you," Reed continued, his voice loud enough for the hallway to hear. "Items don't just disappear. Someone took them, and you were on duty." Miguel's eyes dropped to the floor. His accent thickened when he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I clean only. I don't touch things that are not mine. I swear." Reed scoffed. "You people always say that." The words landed heavier than the accusation itself. Miguel flinched, just slightly. His fingers tightened around the cart handle until his knuckles went pale. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in surrender. "I am sorry," he said. "It will not happen again." Ethan felt something tighten behind his ribs. Ranger rose to his feet. The dog didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He simply stood, body suddenly rigid, ears forward, gaze locked on Reed. A low tension traveled through him, subtle but unmistakable, like a wire pulled taut. Ethan inhaled slowly. He knew that reaction. Ranger had responded that way before, never to shouting, never to anger alone, but to something colder, something dishonest. Reed noticed the dog and stepped back half a pace, irritation flashing across his face. "Control your animal," he snapped, directing the comment at Ethan without looking at him directly. "He's controlled," Ethan replied calmly. Reed scoffed again, muttering something under his breath, then turned back to Miguel. "I'm watching you," Reed said. "One more incident, and we'll have to reevaluate your position." Miguel nodded again. He always nodded. Reed walked away, his shoes clicking against the tile, already done with the man he had just diminished. The hallway fell silent. Miguel exhaled shakily and pushed his cart forward, wheels squeaking softly. He didn't look at Ethan. He didn't look at Ranger. He moved on as if nothing had happened, as if this was simply another correction to be absorbed and forgotten. Ethan watched him go. He did not intervene. That fact disturbed him more than he expected. Rehook moment. As Miguel disappeared around the corner, Ranger did something Ethan had never seen him do before. The dog took 2 slow steps forward, then stopped, turning his head back toward Miguel's retreating figure. His tail hung still. His eyes followed the janitor until he was completely out of sight. Then, Ranger let out a quiet sound. Not a growl, not a whine. Something lower, something uncertain. Ethan felt a chill pass through him. Ranger didn't do uncertainty. Ethan left the building later that morning, Ranger walking at his heel. Outside, the city buzzed with motion, cars passing, people hurrying past one another without contact. He should have let it go. It wasn't his business. He had promised himself a long time ago that he would stop stepping into other people's storms. But as he walked, a memory surfaced uninvited. His father, standing in a warehouse office years ago, cap in hand, shoulders bent under the weight of a supervisor's stare. A good man accused of a mistake he hadn't made. A man who had swallowed his pride because mouths at home needed feeding. Ethan hadn't helped then either. That night, he lay awake listening to the building settle. Ranger stretched along the floor beside the bed. The dog slept lightly, ears twitching at distant sounds. Ethan stared at the ceiling, replaying the scene in the hallway, the way Miguel's voice had dropped, the way Reed hadn't needed to raise his voice to assert control. The next morning, Ethan noticed something else. The security camera above the third-floor corridor, the one nearest Miguel's cleaning route, was dark. A small red indicator light that should have been blinking steadily was off. Ethan paused beneath it, looking up. Ranger stopped too. The dog lifted his nose, sniffing the air, then looked back at Ethan, head tilted slightly. A question without words. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't know what was happening in that building. Not yet, but something was wrong. And Ranger knew it. Ethan did not begin his observations with suspicion. He began with rhythm. After years in environments where survival depended on reading patterns before danger announced itself, he had learned that truth rarely appeared as a single event. It revealed itself through repetition. So instead of asking questions, instead of confronting anyone or drawing attention, Ethan simply lived inside the building as if he were nothing more than another quiet tenant with a dog and an unremarkable routine. Each morning, he left his apartment at roughly the same time. Each evening, he returned after dark. He took Ranger for walks through the same hallways, the same stairwells, the same concrete paths around the building. To anyone watching, it would have looked mundane. But Ethan was not watching life pass. He was measuring it. He noted when the elevators broke down and how long repairs took. He noticed which lights flickered and which ones were replaced immediately. He listened to the cadence of doors opening and closing, the subtle shift in sound when the building transitioned from occupied to empty. He remembered faces, not names, who walked quickly, who avoided eye contact, who lingered in shared spaces longer than necessary. Miguel Alvarez fit into the rhythm like a quiet metronome. The janitor worked 6 days a week, always starting early, always finishing late. He pushed his cart methodically, wiping surfaces others barely noticed. His movements were economical, almost reverent, as if the building itself deserved respect. Ethan began to see Miguel everywhere, mopping the lobby floor before sunrise, emptying trash bins long after most residents had gone to bed. And every time Ethan saw him, Miguel carried himself the same way, shoulders slightly forward, gaze lowered, presence minimized. What changed was not Miguel. What changed was what happened around him. The first report came from a woman on the 5th floor, a package missing from outside her door. She complained loudly in the lobby, frustration cracking her voice. Thomas Reed listened with a practiced frown and nodded gravely. Someone suggested theft. Reed glanced, almost casually, toward the janitor's cart parked nearby. Miguel said nothing. 2 days later, a resident on the 2nd floor claimed a watch had disappeared from his apartment. Reed's voice carried down the hallway as he spoke about protocol and trust violations. Once again, Miguel was on duty. Once again, Miguel apologized without being accused directly. Ethan noticed something else then. The hallway camera outside the 2nd floor stairwell was dark. No red light, no soft hum, just a black dome reflecting the fluorescent ceiling. It happened again a week later. A missing tablet, a vanished envelope of cash. Always during Miguel's shift. Always when a camera nearby was listed as under maintenance. By the 3rd incident, Ethan was no longer guessing. He was mapping. At night, Ethan began writing things down. Not names, not accusations, just facts. Dates, times, locations, camera positions. He wrote in a small notebook with unlined pages, his handwriting precise but unadorned. Ranger lay beside him as he worked, occasionally lifting his head when Ethan paused too long on a thought. Ranger, too, had developed a pattern. Every evening walk took them past the same point in the building's lower level. The basement corridor smelled of concrete dust and cold metal, the air heavier there, less traveled. Ranger would slow as they approached the storage area, his gait shifting almost imperceptibly. He didn't pull. He didn't resist. He simply stopped for a moment longer than necessary, nose angled toward a reinforced metal door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Ethan never forced him forward. He let the moment pass each time. The dog's reaction was subtle but consistent, and consistency was never accidental. One evening, as they returned from the basement, Ethan encountered Sarah Coleman near the mailboxes. She was in her late 30s, tall and lean, with a runner's build and an energy that didn't quite settle. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, strands escaping around her face, as if she never bothered to tame them completely. She wore jeans, a soft gray hoodie, and carried a laptop bag slung over one shoulder. Her skin was pale, but not fragile, marked by faint freckles and the slight darkness beneath her eyes of someone who spent too much time thinking and not enough time sleeping. Sarah had the posture of someone accustomed to standing her ground without raising her voice. She glanced at Ranger first, then at Ethan. "He always watches like that?" she asked, nodding toward the dog. "Only when something doesn't add up," Ethan replied. Sarah gave a short, humorless smile. "That figures." She hesitated, then spoke again, lowering her voice instinctively. "You live here long enough. You start noticing patterns too." Ethan met her gaze, but didn't push. "People keep losing things," she continued, "and somehow it's always inconveniently unclear how." "Camera maintenance," Ethan said. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "So you've seen it too." Sarah explained she worked in cybersecurity for a logistics firm. Nothing related to the building, nothing that gave her access to its systems. But years of staring at data streams had trained her to recognize when information was being shaped rather than lost. She'd filed a complaint weeks ago after her own apartment key fob malfunctioned during one of the so-called maintenance windows. Reed had dismissed it as coincidence. "That was the first time I realized this place isn't just old," she said. "It's curated." Ethan nodded once. They parted without exchanging numbers, without promises. Just a shared awareness that neither of them was imagining things. Later that night, Ethan returned to the basement alone. Not to investigate. Not yet. He stood at the end of the corridor, the reinforced door in view. Ranger sat beside him, calm but alert. The building was quiet. Too quiet. No footsteps. No elevator chime. Then, Ranger did something that made Ethan's breath still. The dog lowered himself slowly, deliberately, into a down position. His ears remained upright, his gaze fixed on the door. His body language shifted from curiosity to readiness. Not threat. Anticipation. Ethan followed Ranger's line of sight and noticed something he had missed before. A thin scuff mark on the floor, just beneath the door. Fresh. Parallel. As if something heavy had been dragged recently. Ranger's tail gave a single, controlled sweep. Ethan stepped back. Whatever was behind that door was not meant to be found. The next morning, Ethan watched Reed from a distance. Thomas Reed moved through the building with ease, greeting residents by name, his smile ready but shallow. He shook hands, offered sympathetic nods, spoke about upcoming improvements and future amenities. To anyone unfamiliar with power dynamics, he looked like a man doing his job. But Ethan saw what Reed didn't notice, how conversations ended when he approached, how Miguel grew smaller in his presence, how maintenance reports were filed and closed without trace. Ethan did not hate Reed. He didn't need to. By the end of the week, Ethan's notebook contained a single circled line, written in careful block letters. "Cameras go blind when blame is needed." He closed the notebook and slid it back into his jacket. Ranger rose smoothly to his feet. Whatever was happening in that building, it was no longer random. And Ethan was done pretending it was. Frank Doyle had the kind of face that told a story even when his mouth stayed shut. Ethan first noticed him on a Thursday night, just past 10, when the building had slipped into its quieter rhythm. Frank sat behind the security desk in the lobby, shoulders slightly hunched, one elbow resting on the counter, as he flipped slowly through a folded newspaper he had no intention of finishing. He was in his late 60s, tall once, now softened by age. His hair was white and thinning, combed straight back in a habit that had survived decades. A gray mustache framed his mouth, trimmed neatly but without care for style. His uniform fit him loosely, as if he had lost weight recently, or simply no longer bothered to tailor himself to anything new. What stood out most was his posture, not weak, but cautious. Frank moved like a man who had learned that stillness attracted less attention than action. Ethan stopped near the desk, as if checking his phone. Ranger sat at his heel, calm and composed, his tail resting lightly against the floor. Frank glanced down at the dog first, then up at Ethan. "Big shepherd," Frank said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "You don't see many that old still this sharp." "He's earned the right to slow down," Ethan replied. Frank nodded, the corners of his mouth tightening in something close to a smile. "I know the feeling." They stood there for a moment, the silence comfortable but alert. Frank returned to his paper. Ethan didn't push the conversation further. He understood men like Frank. You didn't approach them head on. You waited until they chose to speak. Over the next few nights, Ethan lingered just long enough for familiarity to grow. A nod, a brief exchange about the weather, a comment about the elevator being down again. Frank never volunteered much, but he remembered details. What floor Ethan lived on, Ranger's name, the fact that Ethan walked late, always at the same hour. One night, as the building settled into near stillness, Frank spoke without looking up. "You don't sleep much," he said. Ethan leaned against the counter. "Sleep comes when it wants." Frank exhaled slowly. "That's what my wife used to say after the kids were born. She never got it back either." There was a pause, a small opening. Frank folded the newspaper carefully, setting it aside. "You noticing anything strange around here?" he asked, his voice low. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Ranger shifted slightly, then settled again, lying down at Frank's feet. The dog's presence was deliberate, non-threatening, unguarded. "Patterns," Ethan said finally. Frank's jaw tightened. "Yeah," he muttered. "That's what I was afraid of." Frank leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the blank security monitors behind the desk. His reflection stared back at him from the dark screens. "I've worked security my whole life," he said. "Factories, warehouses, office parks. You learn real quick when things don't line up. And this place?" He shook his head. "Things line up a little too neatly." He hesitated, then continued. "The cameras? They're not broken." Ethan remained still. "They never were," Frank said. "Maintenance logs say they go down, but I've seen the feeds. The originals. Someone's overwriting them, manually." Ranger lifted his head slightly, ears angling forward. Frank noticed. "That dog listens better than most people," he said softly. Frank rubbed his palms together, a nervous habit. His hands were thick, scarred, the hands of someone who had worked physical jobs before settling into night shifts. He looked tired, not just from age, but from carrying something too long. "Reed's got access," Frank went on. "Storage schedules, server room, all of it. I asked once why the logs didn't match the timestamps. You know what he said?" Ethan met his gaze. Frank snorted bitterly. "Said I was lucky to still have a job at my age." The words sat between them, heavy and unfinished. "I've got a pension coming in 6 months," Frank said. "A wife with medical bills, a grandson starting college. I can't afford to be a hero." Ethan nodded. "I'm not asking you to be one." Frank looked at him then, really looked. The lines around his eyes deepened. "Then what are you asking?" Ethan's voice was calm, even. "I'm asking you not to stand alone if you decide to speak." Frank swallowed hard. For a moment, the lobby lights flickered, the hum of the building pressing in. Ranger shifted again, inching closer to Frank's leg, resting his chin lightly against the man's shoe. The contact was gentle, grounding. Frank stared down at the dog, something in his expression softening. "You know," Frank said quietly, "when my boy was little, we had a shepherd too. Same look in the eyes. Like he understood more than he let on." Ranger didn't move. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper, worn at the creases. "Temporary access code," he said. "Storage only. Changes every week. He slid it across the counter. Ethan didn't touch it right away. You don't have to do this, Ethan said. Frank shook his head. I already did. Long time ago. Every night I stayed quiet. He pushed the paper closer. I just don't want it to be for nothing. Ethan took the code and folded it once, tucking it into his jacket. I won't waste it. Frank nodded once, sharply, as if cutting something loose. He turned his chair away from the desk, eyes fixed forward. Conversation over. As Ethan turned to leave, Ranger paused. The dog rose slowly and looked back at Frank. Not with tension, not with alertness, but with something closer to recognition. His eyes held steady, amber and deep, reflecting the overhead lights. Frank felt it and turned. For a brief second, man and dog locked gazes. Then Ranger lowered his head slightly, not submission, but acknowledgement. Frank's breath caught. Damn, he whispered. Feels like a promise. Ethan didn't correct him. The following night, Ethan stood in the basement corridor again, the access code warm in his pocket. He didn't approach the door. Not yet. He listened instead, to the building, to the faint hum of machinery behind concrete walls, to the quiet rhythm of Ranger's breathing beside him. Above them, Thomas Reed laughed with a group of residents near the elevator, his voice carrying easily through the building. He spoke of improvements, of upgrades, of a better future. Miguel passed silently in the background, pushing his cart. Ethan watched him go, the weight of Frank's confession settling into place. This wasn't negligence. It wasn't coincidence. It was design. And designs, once seen clearly, could be dismantled. Ethan placed a hand on Ranger's neck, feeling the steady strength there. They weren't alone anymore. The rain began just after midnight, the kind that didn't announce itself with thunder, but settled in quietly, soaking everything it touched until the world felt heavier. Water slid down the concrete walls of the building and pooled along the edges of the parking lot, blurring the reflections of dim security lights. Ethan waited until the sound of rain became constant, until it masked smaller noises and softened the building's awareness of itself. He and Ranger entered through the side door that led to the lower level, the same door residents used to access storage lockers and the trash compactor. The keycard Frank had provided worked exactly as it should. No alarms, no resistance. The door opened with a dull click and closed behind them, sealing out the night. Ethan moved with restraint, not stealth. There was a difference. Stealth tried not to be seen. Restraint assumed visibility and chose calm anyway. He walked at a measured pace, boots quiet against the concrete, posture relaxed enough to appear unremarkable if someone happened to glance down the corridor. Ranger stayed close, his movements fluid and disciplined, nails barely audible on the floor. The basement smelled the way basements always did. Cold metal, damp cement, the faint chemical tang of cleaning agents. Pipes ran overhead in organized chaos, some wrapped in insulation, others bare and sweating in the humid air. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting uneven shadows that made the space feel longer than it was. They passed rows of assigned storage cages, each marked with faded numbers and padlocks of varying age. Most were dusty, untouched for months. A few showed signs of regular access, fresh scuffs on the floor, fingerprints smudged into the metal mesh. Ranger's pace slowed, not abruptly, not enough to draw attention, just enough for Ethan to feel it through the leash. The dog's head dipped slightly, nostrils flaring as he sampled the air. His ears angled forward, then outward, triangulating sound and scent. His tail remained low and still. This wasn't excitement. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Ethan stopped walking. They stood there for several seconds, letting the silence speak. Somewhere above them, water rushed through pipes as toilets flushed and showers ran. The building was alive, unaware. Ranger took one step forward and stopped again, gaze fixed on a metal cabinet recessed into the wall at the far end of the corridor. It was old, industrial, painted a dull gray that had chipped away in places to reveal bare steel beneath. A simple stencil marked it. Maintenance. No padlock, no warning signs. Just a handle worn smooth by frequent use. Ethan hadn't noticed it before. He had walked past it half a dozen times without seeing it. That bothered him. He moved closer, careful not to rush. Ranger stayed directly in front of him now, body angled slightly sideways, positioning himself between Ethan and the cabinet. The dog didn't bare his teeth or stiffen into aggression. He simply stood there, solid and immovable, a quiet barrier. Ethan recognized the behavior instantly. Cover. He crouched slowly, bringing himself level with Ranger's shoulder. The dog's muscles were taut beneath his coat, warm and steady. Ethan reached out and rested 2 fingers lightly against Ranger's collar, not to restrain him, but to ground himself. "Easy," he murmured. Ranger didn't move. The cabinet door bore faint scratches near the handle, shallow but numerous, as if keys or metal tools had brushed against it repeatedly. Beneath it, the concrete floor showed darker streaks, thin lines where something heavy had been dragged back and forth over time. Ethan leaned closer, careful not to touch anything yet. The smell was unmistakable now. Not rot, not trash. Stress. Human stress left a scent, subtle but persistent, especially when repeated over long periods. Ranger's nose picked it up easily. Ethan had learned to trust that instinct long ago. He reached for the handle. The cabinet opened with a soft creak. Inside, the space was deeper than expected, extending farther back into the wall than its exterior suggested. Shelves lined the interior, metal on metal, each one holding items that did not belong there. Boxes, loose objects, plastic bags labeled with dates and apartment numbers, a wristwatch resting atop folded fabric, a tablet sealed in a padded sleeve, an envelope, its corner torn, revealing the edge of folded bills. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. This wasn't random storage. This was cataloged. He took out his phone, switched off the flash, and began taking photographs, careful to capture details without rearranging anything. Dates, labels, the way items were grouped by time rather than type, evidence of intent. Ranger remained in position, eyes flicking briefly toward the corridor before returning to the cabinet. The dog's ears twitched. Someone was coming. Ethan heard the footsteps a moment later, unhurried, confident, the sound of shoes that didn't expect resistance. Thomas Reed rounded the corner, umbrella still folded in his hand, rainwater dripping onto the floor behind him. He stopped short when he saw Ethan and Ranger, surprise flashing across his face before it was replaced by practiced irritation. "What are you doing down here?" Reed demanded. Ethan straightened slowly, not stepping away from the cabinet. Ranger shifted his stance, placing himself squarely between Ethan and Reed now, broad shoulders blocking the narrow space. "Just checking my storage unit," Ethan replied evenly. Reed's eyes flicked to the open cabinet. His jaw tightened. "That area is restricted," Reed said. "You can't be back here without authorization." Ranger took one deliberate step forward. Not aggressive, not threatening, final. Reed hesitated. It was subtle, but Ethan saw it. The way Reed's weight shifted backward, the way his gaze darted toward the dog, and then away again. The confidence Reed carried so easily upstairs faltered here, stripped of witnesses and authority. "Call maintenance," Reed said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "They'll help you find whatever you're looking for." "I already did," Ethan replied. Reed opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. The rain outside intensified, hammering against the building, filling the silence with white noise. Ranger didn't move. Reed took a step back. "Don't make this complicated," he said, his voice lower now. Ethan met his eyes. "It already is." For a long moment, They stood there, neither advancing nor retreating. Then Reed exhaled sharply and turned away, shoes scraping against the floor as he left the corridor without another word. As Reed disappeared around the corner, Ranger did something unexpected. He relaxed. Not fully, but enough that Ethan felt the shift immediately. The tension bled from the dog's frame, replaced by a quiet certainty. Ranger turned his head and looked up at Ethan, eyes steady, almost reassuring. The message was clear. You saw what you needed to see. Ethan felt a strange, grounding calm settle over him. He closed the cabinet carefully, leaving it exactly as he had found it. He took one last photograph of the handle, the scratches, the scuffed floor beneath. Then he stepped back, unclipping the leash slightly so Ranger could move freely again. They left the basement the same way they entered, calmly, legally, without drawing attention. Outside, the rain washed over them as if nothing had happened. Ethan stood beneath the overhang near the entrance for a moment, watching water stream down Ranger's coat in darkened rivulets. The dog shook himself once, droplets scattering across the concrete. Ethan clipped the leash back into place. He understood now. Ranger didn't know names. He didn't understand motives or legal structures. But he knew where truth accumulated, where fear lingered, where lies were handled too often by the same hands. Instinct didn't explain itself. It pointed. Ethan walked back inside, mind already shifting from discovery to preparation. He didn't need to confront Reed. Not yet. He had something far more dangerous than accusations. He had proof. Ethan did not sleep that night, not because of fear and not because of urgency, but because the shape of the truth had begun to change. The evidence he carried now was no longer abstract, no longer lines in a notebook or photographs stored quietly on a phone. It had weight, meaning, and meaning, once uncovered, demanded to be understood fully before it could be used. Morning came with a dull gray sky and the smell of rain-soaked concrete. Ethan took Ranger out early, before the building fully woke. Miguel was already at work, moving slowly down the hallway with his cart, checking the corners others ignored. He paused briefly at the stairwell, testing the emergency door with a practiced hand before continuing on. The motion was small, automatic, and deeply ingrained. Ethan noticed it because now he was looking for it. Later that afternoon, he found Sarah Coleman in the shared laundry room, folding clothes with methodical precision. She stood straight even when she relaxed, her movements economical, as if she disliked wasting energy. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, strands escaping around her temples, and faint shadows beneath her eyes suggested long hours and restless thought. She wore a plain black t-shirt and jeans, her posture casual but alert. Ranger lay nearby, chin resting on his paws, watching her with calm interest. "You said you worked in cybersecurity," Ethan said, keeping his tone neutral. "What exactly do you do?" Sarah didn't look up right away. "I protect systems people don't think about until they fail," she replied. "Logs, redundancies, backups, things that aren't supposed to be noticed." She glanced at him then. "Why?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He pulled out his phone and showed her one of the photographs from the basement cabinet, the labeled bags, the dates. Sarah's expression changed. Not shock, but recognition. "I knew it," she murmured. She set her folded clothes aside and leaned against the machine, arms crossed. "I lost a key fob 3 months ago," she said. "Reported it. Reed told me it was probably misplaced. Then 2 weeks later, someone accused Miguel of going into apartments without permission." Her jaw tightened. "I checked the system logs that night. Not the building's, mine, my router, my smart lock history. Nothing matched the story." She hesitated, then added, "I didn't push it. Thought I was overreacting." Ethan nodded. "You weren't." Sarah studied Ranger for a moment. "He always this calm?" Only when he trusts someone, Ethan said. Sarah exhaled slowly. I can help, she said. Legally. That word mattered. Sarah explained that the building's security system stored redundant footage locally before uploading compressed versions to the main server. Most residents didn't know that. Most managers didn't bother checking. But Sarah had once worked on a contract involving similar systems, and she knew where backup data often hid. Places left untouched because no one expected anyone else to look there. It won't be everything, she warned, but it'll be enough to establish a pattern. They met that evening in Sarah's apartment, a clean, spare space filled with books, a standing desk, and the quiet hum of machines. She moved with focused efficiency, fingers flying across the keyboard as code scrolled past the screen. Ethan stood behind her, arms folded loosely, watching the process unfold without interfering. Ranger lay near the window, eyes half-lidded but alert. The footage loaded slowly. Hallways, stairwells, shadows shifting with passing hours. Then a familiar figure appeared. Miguel. He moved exactly as Ethan remembered. Methodical, unhurried, never lingering where he didn't belong. Timestamps aligned with his shift. Doors remained closed. No suspicious behavior. Sarah's fingers stilled. Wait, she said. She rewound the footage and zoomed in on a corner of the frame. A date flashed across the screen. 5 years earlier. Smoke filled the hallway, thick and dark, obscuring the lights. An alarm screamed somewhere in the distance. Figures ran past the camera, some coughing, some shouting. The footage jittered as heat warped the air. Then Miguel appeared. He wasn't running out. He was moving in. Sarah leaned closer to the screen. What is this? She whispered. Ethan didn't answer. He watched Miguel disappear into the smoke, pushing open a door marked Stairwell B. Minutes passed. Long, terrifying minutes, where nothing happened but chaos. Then Miguel reappeared, carrying a small limp shape in his arms. A child. Moments later, he returned again, this time supporting a woman whose face was streaked with soot and tears. Miguel guided her carefully, coughing violently but steady on his feet. Only after she reached safety did he collapse against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor, gasping for air. The footage ended. The room was silent. Sarah swallowed hard. I remember this, she said softly. The fire. Everyone talked about how lucky we were. No one died. She looked at Ethan. No one ever said why. Ethan felt something settle into place inside him. As if responding to the shift in the room, Ranger rose and walked toward the screen. He sat directly in front of it, eyes fixed on Miguel's frozen image. His posture was relaxed, familiar, safe. Sarah noticed. He knows him, she said. He trusts him, Ethan replied. And that trust was older than any accusation. The pieces aligned quickly after that. Miguel's fixation on emergency exits, his habit of checking stairwell doors, the way he paused at fire extinguishers during his rounds. These weren't quirks. They were echoes. He went back, Sarah said, when everyone else ran. And no one recorded his name, Ethan said. Sarah shook her head slowly. Because he didn't have papers, she said. No commendation, no official record, just silence. Silence was easy to erase. Ethan thought of the cabinet in the basement, the careful labeling, the dates. This isn't just about theft, he said. It's about replacement. Sarah nodded. The company that owns this building filed a workforce restructuring proposal last year, she said. Outsourcing cleaning services, short-term contracts, no benefits. And Miguel, Ethan said, costs them more than they want to admit. Sarah closed the laptop. They're not just framing him, she said. "They're clearing him." Ethan looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker on as evening fell. Somewhere below, Miguel pushed his cart down another hallway, unaware that his past had finally surfaced. Ranger returned to Ethan's side, pressing lightly against his leg. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's head. "This isn't just about proving innocence," he said quietly. "It's about restoring value." Sarah met his gaze. "Then we do it right." Later that night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, reviewing the footage again. Not for evidence, but for understanding. He watched Miguel disappear into smoke, watched him return carrying strangers who would never know his name. Ethan closed his eyes. This wasn't a mistake. This was a system designed to erase people like Miguel, useful when invisible, disposable when inconvenient. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line beneath the others. "They erase what they can't quantify." Ranger lifted his head and looked at him. Ethan closed the notebook. Now he knew what he was fighting. Ethan understood something clearly now. Confronting Thomas Reed would satisfy anger, but it would not dismantle the machinery that had allowed him to operate unchecked. Systems did not collapse because someone shouted at them. They collapsed when pressure was applied in the right places, by the right people, at the right time. So, Ethan did not confront Reed. Instead, he began to connect. He met Sarah Coleman first, not in her apartment this time, but in a quiet corner of a neighborhood cafe, a few blocks from the building. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, catching dust motes in the air. Sarah sat with her back to the wall, laptop closed but within reach. She wore a dark jacket over a simple shirt, her hair pulled back in a practical knot. Without the glow of screens around her, she looked more tired than usual, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes deeper. But her posture was steady. She had the look of someone who had made a decision and accepted the weight that came with it. "I pulled everything I could," she said once Ethan sat down. "Original camera backups, access logs, maintenance overrides. Nothing illegal. Everything traceable." She slid a slim folder across the table. "Redundancies," she continued. "They never expected anyone to look for them." Ethan nodded, flipping through the printed summaries without lingering. He trusted Sarah's precision. Next came Frank Doyle. They met in the parking lot behind a closed hardware store just before dawn, the sky still dark and heavy with early fog. Frank leaned against his aging sedan, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. In the muted light, he looked older than Ethan remembered, shoulders slightly more rounded, the lines on his face deeper. But his eyes were clear, resolute. "I wrote it all down," Frank said, pulling a small notebook from his coat. "Shift schedules, storage access, times Reed came through after hours." He hesitated, then added, "I signed it." Ethan met his gaze. "You don't have to." "I do," Frank interrupted. "I spent too long being quiet." Frank handed over the notebook and straightened, as if letting go of something that had weighed on him for years. Miguel Alvarez was the last piece. Ethan did not approach him directly at first. He watched instead. How Miguel worked, how he avoided drawing attention, how his shoulders tightened whenever Reed passed nearby. One evening, after most residents had returned to their apartments, Ethan approached him in the hallway near the stairwell. Miguel looked up, startled, then relaxed when he saw Ranger. The dog wagged his tail once, softly, stepping closer to Miguel's side. "You take good care of this place," Ethan said. Miguel nodded, uncertain. "I try." Ethan chose his words carefully. "Some people want to say you've done things you haven't." Miguel's expression closed instantly. Years of caution hardened his features. "I don't want trouble," he said quietly. "You're already carrying it," Ethan replied. "You just shouldn't carry it alone." Miguel said nothing, but his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip on the cart. Ranger leaned in gently, pressing his shoulder against Miguel's leg. The contact was steady, reassuring. Ethan waited. "I don't need you to accuse anyone," Ethan said. "I just need you to tell the truth when asked." Miguel swallowed. "I can do that," he said finally. The pieces were ready. Ethan didn't deliver them himself. Sarah contacted a tenants advocacy group she'd worked with once during a data privacy case. They listened carefully, their skepticism softening as evidence stacked neatly into place. The group connected them to a volunteer attorney named Helen Moore, a woman in her early 50s with steel gray hair cut into a sharp bob and a reputation for patience that bordered on stubbornness. Helen read everything twice, asked questions that cut to the bone, and nodded once when she finished. "This isn't just misconduct," she said. "This is systemic." Word began to spread, quietly at first, then louder. Residents talked to one another in hallways and elevators. Stories surfaced, small at first, then more damning. A missing heirloom, a broken lock dismissed as user error, maintenance requests closed without explanation. Patterns that had once felt isolating now aligned into something undeniable. The property management company noticed. Emails were sent, meetings scheduled, an internal review announced under the neutral language of procedural oversight. Thomas Reed stopped smiling. He still walked the building, still greeted residents, but his steps were quicker now, his gaze sharper. He avoided Miguel entirely. When he passed Ethan in the lobby one afternoon, his eyes lingered just long enough to communicate threat. Ethan didn't return it. One evening, as residents gathered in the common area for an impromptu meeting, organized by the advocacy group, Ranger did something that caught everyone's attention. He rose from Ethan's side and walked slowly across the room, stopping in front of Miguel. He sat, perfectly still, and looked up at him. Not at Ethan, at Miguel. The room fell silent. Miguel froze, unsure what to do. His hands hovered awkwardly at his sides until Sarah nodded gently. "It's okay," she said. Miguel rested a trembling hand on Ranger's head. The dog closed his eyes. For the first time since Ethan had known him, Miguel stood straight. The meeting ended with agreement rather than applause. Residents signed statements. Helen collected affidavits. The threat of a class action lawsuit loomed quietly but unmistakably over the property management firm. 2 days later, Reed was called into a closed-door meeting. He did not return. An email went out that afternoon announcing his departure, citing a restructuring initiative and a commitment to transparency. Another email followed, outlining a pause on workforce changes pending legal review. Miguel was called into the office the next morning. He returned an hour later, stunned. "They want me back," he said to Ethan, disbelief thick in his voice. "With a contract. A real one. Benefits. Protections. Back pay for missed hours. An acknowledgement, not public, but official, that he had been wronged." Ethan nodded. That's how it should have been from the start. Miguel looked down at Ranger, who wagged his tail once, softly. "Thank you," Miguel said. "Both of you." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, Ethan stood on his balcony, city lights flickering in the distance. Ranger lay beside him, head resting on his paws. The building behind them felt different now, lighter, somehow. Truth hadn't arrived with sirens or fists. It had arrived quietly, placed where it belonged. The building no longer felt like it was holding its breath. Ethan noticed it in the small things first. The way conversations lingered in the hallways instead of cutting short. The way doors stayed open a second longer. The way people began to meet each other's eyes without immediately looking away. Fear had a sound when it lived somewhere for too long. It hummed beneath everything. Now that sound was gone. Miguel Alvarez walked the halls differently. He still wore the same gray uniform, still pushed the same cart, but his shoulders were no longer folded inward. His back was straighter, his steps more deliberate. When residents passed him, they didn't pretend not to see him anymore. They nodded. They smiled. Some stopped to say thank you, awkward at first, unsure how to address a man they had never really allowed themselves to know. Miguel accepted it all quietly. Gratitude had never been something he expected. The legal support came quickly once the paperwork began. Helen Moore coordinated with an immigration advocacy group, and within days, Miguel had an appointment scheduled to review his status. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't instant. But it was a path. And for someone who had lived for years with none, that mattered more than promises. Ethan watched this unfold from a distance. He did not insert himself into conversations or meetings. He didn't need to. His work was finished, and he understood when to step back. The building didn't belong to him. It belonged to the people who lived there, who had finally decided to protect one another. On his last morning, Ethan packed with the same efficiency he brought to everything. There wasn't much to gather. Clothes folded into a single duffel, a notebook slipped into the side pocket, a pair of worn boots placed carefully by the door. Ranger lay nearby, watching with calm awareness. He didn't pace or whine. He understood departure as well as he understood vigilance. Ethan clipped the leash on and opened the door. The hallway camera outside his apartment blinked red, alive and unmistakable. Ethan paused, looking up at it. For a moment, he remembered standing beneath dark lenses weeks earlier, wondering who watched and who was erased. Now the camera saw everything, but more importantly, the people beneath it saw themselves. They walked down the hall together, boots and paws echoing softly. As they reached the stairwell, a familiar voice called out, "Ethan!" Miguel stood near the janitor's closet, hands folded in front of him. Up close, the years showed more clearly. The lines around his eyes, the faint tremor in his fingers. But there was something steady there now that hadn't been before. Dignity didn't change a man's age. It changed how he carried it. Ethan stopped. Ranger stepped forward first. Miguel hesitated, then knelt slowly, placing a hand on the dog's broad head. Ranger leaned into the touch, accepting it without ceremony. His eyes softened, his tail giving one slow, controlled sweep. Miguel's voice dropped to a whisper. "You knew," he said. "Before anyone." Ranger didn't respond, of course. He simply stayed there, solid and warm, allowing the moment to exist without interruption. Ethan watched quietly. Miguel stood and looked at Ethan, his eyes clear. "I don't know how to thank you," Miguel said. Ethan shook his head. "You don't need to." Miguel nodded, understanding that this wasn't humility. It was truth. They parted without shaking hands, without promises to stay in touch. Some connections were not meant to stretch beyond the moment that required them. As Ethan turned toward the exit, Ranger stopped. The dog looked back over his shoulder one last time, not at Miguel alone, but at the hallway itself. The open doors, the people passing freely, the camera blinking quietly above. Then Ranger exhaled, a long, slow breath, and followed Ethan without resistance. It was the sound of a task completed. Outside, the morning air was cool and clean, the sky a pale blue that promised nothing dramatic. Ethan loaded the duffel into the back of his truck, movements unhurried. Ranger jumped into the passenger seat, settling in with practiced ease, his gaze forward. Before starting the engine, Ethan looked once more at the building. Sarah stood near the entrance, speaking with a neighbor, her posture relaxed for the first time since he had met her. Frank Doyle was there too, no longer behind a desk, his uniform replaced by a jacket and a cap pulled low over his white hair. He raised a hand briefly in acknowledgement. Ethan returned the gesture. The truck pulled away quietly. They drove without music, the road stretching open ahead of them. Ethan felt no triumph, no rush of satisfaction, only a steady calm, the kind that came from knowing something broken had been set right. Not perfectly, Not forever, but enough. Ranger shifted slightly in his seat and rested his head against the window, watching the city slide past. His reflection stared back at him, eyes steady and untroubled. Ethan thought of all the places they had been together, of nights spent listening, of moments where instinct had spoken louder than reason. Fate was not a dramatic thing, he realized. It didn't arrive with signs or speeches. It moved quietly, through choices made when no one was watching. They reached the highway as the sun climbed higher. Ethan merged into traffic and did not look back. Behind them, the building stood with its cameras working, its halls lit, its people unafraid to stand still and be seen. The systems had changed, but more importantly, so had the silence. And sometimes, that was enough. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire. They arrive quietly, through small acts of courage, through a hand that chooses to protect instead of look away, through a heart that listens when something feels wrong. God often works not by changing the world in an instant, but by placing the right people and even the right animals in the right moment. In our daily lives, injustice does not always wear a dramatic face. Sometimes it hides in silence, in fear, in people who feel they have no voice. And sometimes, all it takes to begin change is one person who decides to stand still and see clearly, and another who dares to speak the truth. If this story moved you, let it remind you that kindness is never wasted, and that integrity still matters, even when no one is watching. You may never know whose life is changed by your quiet courage, but God does. If you believe in justice, compassion, and the unseen guidance that walks beside us every day, please share this story with someone who might need hope. Leave a comment and tell us where this message reached you. And if you would like to walk with us through more stories of faith, loyalty, and quiet strength, consider subscribing to this channel. May God watch over you and your loved ones. May He protect the innocent, strengthen the weary, and guide those who choose to do what is right, even when it is difficult. And may His peace follow you, just as faithfully as a loyal companion walks beside the one they trust. Amen.